welcome to today's Guavus webinar. Our topic today is 5G rollout challenges and analytics-driven remedies for mobile network operators. I'm your host, Steve Collins, and I'd like to start out by introducing each of our panelists. I'm going to start with Miguel Karamas, who's the Director of Network Planning at Verizon Wireless. Hello, Miguel. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
And we have Amy Cameron, who's a Senior Analyst at STL Partners. Amy, thank you for joining.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And we have Chris Neisinger, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Guavus. Chris, good to have you aboard.
Yep, good morning, everyone.
So the topic for today is the role that analytics will play in operating 5G networks. You know, with 5G, we're looking at scale, complexity, supplier diversity in the underlying infrastructure, a whole bunch of issues that I think are going to present operators with some significant operational challenges. It's going to be a different world than I think the one they've grown accustomed to with 4G. So that's what our panelists are going to be talking about. You know, how are we going to move from this world of the known today, the 4G LTE world, into the world of 5G. So to get this started, we're going to have Amy set the stage for our panel discussion, and she's going to present an overview of some of the key challenges that operators face as they begin to roll out their 5G networks, as well as the issues and concerns related to adopting essentially what are analytics-driven processes for overcoming these operational challenges. So with that, Amy, I'll turn it over to you and let you spend a little time talking us through that.
So as Steve says, I'm just going to give kind of a high level bird's eye view of what's going on in the industry so far around AI and analytics and the move towards 5G. At STL Partners, we've done lots of research looking at, trying to understand how operators have adopted these technologies, what are their ambitions, how far are they going? And this is, one of the results from a interview session that interview program that we did earlier this year, where we spoke to a number of telecoms operators to understand, how far along are they in their automation process. And what you can see here, there, picked 4 examples from that interview program in areas that are pretty popular today with the application of analytics into network operations. So what you can see is that at the top, we've got network security, and this is the most advanced use case that we have on this list, where, the operator in question that is the example here has moved well beyond reactive and proactive monitoring and diagnosing the problem, where it's now automating the decision and recommendation around what to do to remedy the problem, and is just one step away from really closing that loop fully. But if you look at the other examples in terms of network traffic management, sort of figuring out how to prioritize resources within a fixed or mobile network. The third example, workforce management, how to make the most of field force engineers and to make sure that their routes are the most optimized and that they're only going to houses that they need to. And finally, network problem diagnosis, which is quite broad, but obviously here fault resolution, root cause analysis are big areas for application of automation and analytics, and they're all just a little bit behind, but ahead of monitoring proactively, but not quite ready to close the loop. And what we've found is that really what's holding people back is a combination of both technical and cultural barriers. So this is again from another piece of research we did where we were trying to understand what were the key challenges for telecoms operators in applying advanced analytics. And these were the 3 main things that came out of it. So first and foremost, having clean and unified and accessible data. And what you can see here is that 15% of respondents to this survey found that it was their key foremost problem, but over 3/4 said that it was one of the key issues. And just for context, when I was on a panel earlier this year with some tier 1 European telcos, they were saying that they still spend anywhere from 70 to 90% of their time working on the data rather than the rest of applying analytics. The second one, obviously, skills and capabilities, and we all know that talent in data science, data engineering, software development is scarce. And telcos are competing with a lot of other people to get that skill in-house. But finally, what's interesting here is 50% of people feel that culture is one of the biggest obstacles to implementing AI and automation across their operations. I mean, and that's not surprising because it takes a completely different mindset, room for experimentation, new types of ways of working. And so I'm sure we'll touch on that a bit later. I think another one of the challenges that we come across a lot and that I found a lot in my research is there is sometimes a lack of clarity about what exactly are we aiming for? What is the goal that we are working towards? And on this slide, I've just got one example of an area where the industry and even within a telecoms operator, people are not clear in terms of what they are looking for. So for instance, taking this idea of end-to-end automation or closed loop automation, where are the different ends? Are you thinking from the perspective that we have at the top, where you're thinking across the entire life cycle of the network? So you're thinking at the beginning from planning and design, then to set up, launch, and roll out, and finally into the life cycle management and orchestration of the network. Is that your definition of end-to-end? Or are you potentially thinking differently that the two ends are actually across the network domains, where you're thinking one end is the end user, moving across the access point, the access network, transport, core, all the way through to the internet? Is that the end-to-end that you're thinking of? Or finally, and this is a even broader perspective, are you thinking about incorporating the customer experience as well in there? So you may not just be thinking that end-to-end automation is just about managing the network processes, but also that needs to fit into your customer-facing services, into your billing and your customer care. And that's the full end-to-end journey that you're trying to automate for. And every operator is going to have a different definition. And in lots of different areas, there's this definitional problem. But there needs to be some kind of agreement on what we are working towards if we're going to get there successfully. If we're all going to be, singing from the same hymn sheet within an operator or within a team. So we've talked about some of the challenges. The good news is that virtualization should help to overcome some of these barriers. So if we think, for instance, around data collection and getting insights into the networks, these are things that should be baked into virtual network functions, and being able to implement a closed loop, being able to put that automated action into the end should be a lot easier when you're working in a software-based network. So these really go hand in hand. Baking in you'll get more data that allows you to have more visibility, run those insights, and then implement those insights more effectively in a virtual network. So I'm sure that Miguel and Chris will talk about that with us in more detail later. Now, we know, I'm sure anyone who's been following the industry knows that the virtualization journey for operators has been fraught. It's been really hard. It's been difficult to sustain momentum. It's been much harder than we all thought it was gonna be. But the good news here is that actually it's continuing. So this is some data from a tracker that STL Partners does. So we track all NFV and SDN deployments by telecoms operators that are in the public domain. And on the left-hand side, what you can see is the total number of NFV and SDN deployments worldwide on an annual basis. And obviously in 2020, it was last updated in July. There were some that had been completed. So we mark them down in the year that the program is completed, or that the deployment is completed. And you can see that there are quite a few that are still pending for 2020. And we also added in a number that we think were yet to be announced as of July 2020, but that would come out of the woodwork by the end of the year. And we'll be updating this again shortly. But what you can see is that actually growth in deployments has been strong and been sustained over the last several years. But really what I want to draw your attention to is actually on this right-hand side, where we've broken down the deployments by type. And you can see it's by year. Obviously, there are a lot of colors. It's a little bit hard to read. But I would draw your attention to the non-standalone 5G core software, which is the third bar from the bottom. And what you can see there is that actually that has been a real area of focus in 2019 and 2020 and in progress and pending deployments, where really, you know, we still have quite a few SD-WAN deployments coming out in 2019 and 2020. And I think that that's kind of new entrants catching up because it's been really the leading operators that have made the most advances in NFV and SDN. But it's very interesting to see that the key growth area in the last year or two has been around 5G core software. And so I think that ties in well with today's discussion around how we're going to apply analytics to network operations and looking forward to the 5G era, and how 5G might help us to overcome those challenges or indeed present some new ones. So with that scene setting, I know that we have lots to discuss today, so I will hand back to Stephen, but I will just let you know first that all of these slides will be made available after the webinar.
Okay, thank you, Amy. And I'll invite our panelists to come back on screen here, on video, on audio. That'll be good. And I think this is a good time to ask a couple of our poll questions because they're relevant to what Amy just presented. So the question is, and everyone's free to answer, what is your level of confidence that machine intelligence will prove superior to human operators for managing 5G networks, right? So the premise here is we're going to have to rely on analytics to get things done in a 5G world that we might have relied on humans to get things done in the 4G network. And you got four choices from, you know, low confidence to, you know, high confidence and in between there. So feel free to enter your choice. Be curious to see how people feel about this. And we will discuss these results later on here in the panel discussion. But I wanted to kind of get these data points as a baseline. I have another poll question here that we'll ask, somewhat related, but a little bit of a different spin. So this one is, what level of confidence do you have in analytics-driven closed-loop automation, you know, for self-optimizing, self-healing 5G networks, right? So this specifically relates to the slide that Amy had up about closed loop. You know, how fast can we get there, essentially, I think is what we're looking for here. So again, feel free to give us your take on this. So we'll close this one out, and we're going to set those aside here for a second, and we will follow up on them shortly. So at this point, why don't we jump right into our discussion here? And I'd like to kick this off with a question for Chris and Miguel, but Amy, feel free to jump in as you see fit. So, you know, when operators are rolling out 5G, you know, will they be able to manage these networks using essentially their existing OSS toolkit?
I think often when we look at launching a new generation, we tend to view that new generation through the lens of what we know in the previous generation. So this, you know, happened in 2G and 3G and 4G. You know, not saying that that's bad, because often we're working with both generations at the same time, and the operator needs to manage the transition of customers from one to the other, and there's not a lot of confidence in the new technology, how quickly it's going to get adopted. But I'll say this time it's different. We said that things are different always, but this time it is different. There's a couple of factors. The push for 5G is pretty universal. And also this new generation of 5G is coming along with simultaneous technology waves. Amy mentioned the move of SDN NFV and virtualization. There's cloud architectures, edge computing, and on true web scale beyond just SDN NFV for microservices architectures that have been in the internet environment for a while are really starting to come into telco now. You have massive IoT and automation, self-driving vehicles. So, and yes, significant AI, ML capabilities. So the traditional OSSBSS approach really is not going to be able to enable this tremendous value of 5G. This is really a sea change. I think the industry sees it as a sea change, and it's the perfect time to really look at all processes in the organization and how best to use these new technologies to create an environment where you can monetize the new technology as much as possible and modernize the business model and enable new business models. So no, the question was, can traditional methods be maintained? And our feeling is no. This is the time to really look at new approaches to operating networks.
Miguel?
Yeah, and I'll say I agree with Chris. I think the one thing, maybe a clarification point. In our case, I don't know that we can, or I would consider what we're doing traditional, to be honest. Right, we've been on this journey to modernize the network. The move towards cloud, it's a multi-year effort in Verizon already. It's five years ago or so. We have most of the core virtualized. We are going through the virtualization of the RAN. We are in the midst of and I agree with Chris, right, the move to a true web scale cloud native 5G core that we are building. So I think we have some of the enablers in place. We started the journey a while back. So it's a little bit less of a 4G to 5G transition in our case, and it's more of a moving from like legacy principles to cloud native principles. So I think selfishly, I'm glad that we started this journey in the 4G days. It could be a lot to take on if you were building all this and creating the new environment, including the changing culture all in one shot, because it's a lot, right? Now, the one thing that I would say maybe where there is some runway, right, to implement the changes is in NSA, right, in the non-standalone architecture, you can still reuse some of the things that you put in place on 4G, whatever that might be, even if that means more legacy operations, because you are likely reusing a lot of what you had on the core and in the transport domain as well. Once you move to standalone and once you try to serve all those use cases that Chris was talking about and the new functionality that 5G promises, right, with the higher density of devices, the capabilities of slicing where the workloads move around the network, mobile edge compute, and so on, you definitely cannot operate under all premises. You'll kill your operations team, right? There's too much flexibility, too many options. So flexibility and options are good. At the same time, they bring a lot of complexity, and you do need the network to do more in an automated fashion, data to drive decisions, and engineers to be dedicated to building whatever the new big thing is, rather than just running the network.
Great. So kind of a follow-up on that. If you look at 4G, I don't want to mischaracterize 4G by saying it's sort of heavily siloed and monolithic, but in contrast to 5G, it can look that way, right? Where if you're talking about a 5G network, you've got a bunch of different layers spread across multiple domains, but with software and hardware sourced from different vendors in those different layers and different domains. So it's certainly going to be more diverse and more complex from that perspective. So if you're looking at, approaching the deployment of analytics and machine learning and AI into these multi-vendor environments, what should be the approach? I mean, how should you tackle this? Because there's probably a lot of different places you can start. Chris, you want to take a shot at that?
Yes, I will. So yes, this system, the 5G system, is extremely complex. We've been adding complexity to the network for years. It wasn't that long ago where I remember a certain network I was working on where we got everything from one vendor, from the MSC to the cell sites to the DC power system and the cabling, even the batteries, all stamped with the same vendor name. And that you just can't do that you couldn't do that in 4G, and you definitely cannot do that in 5G. The need for specialization from the vendors and from getting best of class networks and just the ability to put together something from a single vendor point of view is just not viable any longer. So now we're going to have not only multi-vendor, you're going to have multi-core vendors, elements within the core from different vendors, multiple transport vendors, the RAN vendors, and then things with Open RAN. You get even more complexity when you're splitting that. So the question is where to start. I think Amy put something on her chart about what's end to end. You have to pick a big enough end to end to get value. Starting with the entire end to end is probably too big of a problem to start with. You do need to sectionalize a little bit as you plan. So I think where to start is you recognize that siloed solutions give limited value. So if you're doing an automation or an AI-driven solution that's only looking at that transport network, you're going to get a siloed implementation that's fast to deploy, so that's good, but it has short runway of adding value. So recognize that, and then really start with the data architecture and the data collection architecture. I think Amy also put on her slides that operators are spending a lot of time just with the data itself. So we always recommend a distributed architecture. This is a distributed business in telecom. Make use of the edge. And if you start with the correct architecture, you also enable real-time decision-making and support for real-time use cases. Another thing we look at Guavus often is this concept of inside out and outside in. Basically, look at enabling use cases that are subscriber specific, so per subscriber. So from the inside out, the subscriber sees their behavior on the network. And also the outside in is the ability to look from the application or from the network back towards the subscribers. Having the ability to do both enables use cases that unlock a lot of value. And then remember the answer to the first question that it's not just about recreating processes in 4G. It's really about looking at how the business will run going forward. Stay open, stick with standards, stay vendor neutral, and keep the flexibility to avoid proprietary lock-in of proprietary data schemas. So that's kind of where I start with how to sectionalize the problem and get started in providing value to the operator.
Yeah. So Miguel, you're kind of living the dream here, right? What's your take on all this?
Yeah. So I agree with Chris, and the one thing that I would add is kind of like the approach we're taking is even fundamentally culturally, focusing when you are building the architecture of the network in how the data is going to be gathered, how the data is going to be made available, right, to all the upstream systems that need that information, right? And don't assume that today what your data needs are going to be tomorrow. Just gather the data, bring the data up to the bus, have it available in your in your storage systems, because there will be use cases and potential consumers of that data tomorrow that you don't even know about today. Right, and that's a shift kind of in how we architect and build these networks. If you think about even when we're building the 4G network, right, this a human tendency to focus on the functional requirement that you're trying to address, right? So you're building a network to provide a service to the customers, and you kind of have you think about the data as a means to run the network, maybe not so much as a means to generate value. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to change here. Is data is valuable. It can be used for many things. We need to make sure that we are gathering the data at all the layers. And I like the point of the question here that it is increasingly more complicated. It's no longer a vertically integrated turnkey solution from one vendor stamped with that one logo. But like your stack on the cloud applications, or even on the VNF, you have your hypervisor, you have your hardware, you have the transport and routing part also virtualized, so different components in there. And along the way, all of those contribution points to the network have data, visibility to data that could be valuable, right? And so you have to collect it. And now, obviously, to Amy's point in the presentation, and I really like that, it's very important to go from data to information, right? So there is such thing as too much data. If it's not actionable, if it's not relevant, does it really make sense to store it? You have to, that work on normalizing the data so you kind of can easily derive value out of it is very important. And I think it's an opportunity for us MNOs to do better.
Yes. So, so I got a question for Amy and Miguel. If you look at 4G, particularly the early days of 4G, there wasn't a lot of talk about analytics and machine learning and AI. Eventually, we had capabilities that came along that could help augment the operation of those networks, but I'd still put them in the category of kind of helpful but nice to have, versus in 5G, I think analytics, machine learning, and AI become must-have capabilities. So I'd like to get both of your perspectives on kind of that fundamental shift here. Amy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would challenge you a little bit that today AI and analytics is a nice to have. I don't think it is anymore, even in your legacy networks, because I mean, one, if we think about what the industry has achieved already. So, we've done some research looking at what we think the potential value of automation, AI, and analytics could be across telcos operations and in different parts of their businesses, and where operators have reported results. It's less on the network side and most on the customer side. But they're, the leading operators are achieving about 50% of what is possible with today's technologies. So it's not even thinking about what's possible tomorrow. With what's possible today, operators are already achieving, €750,000 in savings over the last 2 years on their customer-facing channels, and that's not even talking about their network channels. So there is money there today. Another example is in energy saving in networks. There's a lot of stuff around. The benchmark is now about saving 15% of your energy costs in your RAN, which is millions of euros or millions of pounds.
Right.
It's a lot of money. So I think it's an absolute necessity today. But the other reason why it's a necessity today, and calling back to what Miguel was saying about the transition towards virtualization and cloud and analytics, getting to grips with new ways of working and what it is you're trying to do and what you should prioritize, and how you incentivize employees to learn new skills or to work in different ways, or to want to not have an easy 9 to 5 where they're doing a repetitive job, and a more creative thinking about what are the big things that they should be doing next. Those are all multi-year activities. So if an operator is thinking, oh, I'll just do this when 5G rolls around, it's going to be too late. They're not going to be able to be relevant, in 5 years' time. They're going to be one of the dinosaurs that might not survive. So that's my point of view.
Yeah, and I think we're in agreement here. There is a lot that we are using today, even in more tactical, like even parts of the network, right? So we have shifted for a few years now from even assurance and operations from a reactive, what I would call a reactive mode, right? Wait for something to fail, open a ticket, everybody troubleshoots, you resolve it. That's mostly gone, right? Like we are using analytics actively to make sure that the issues are detected before they are customer impacting, right? With the goal being the customer should never even know that there was an issue that was boiling in the network, right? And actions taken proactively. So that's one kind of more like things that are being done today. Then even making capital allocation decisions, right, based on where the traffic is, what is the customer behavior, and that in itself is a huge amount of data that needs to be modeled. But when you look, I do agree with the point that maybe you can get by on 4G without it for some of your more like traditional use cases, like serve your consumer network. Not very effective, but you can. But on 5G, when you add all this complexity now with especially slicing, right? And we'll start relatively simple, like you always do with the new technologies, right? Where slices are going to be evolutions of existing services, enterprise, vertical-based applications, and so on. But eventually, the promise is that you're going to get into an environment that's a lot more automated and it's a lot more dynamic, where slices are created on demand to fit a particular use case. And that involves the creation of or spawning specific network functions in different parts of the network, in different geographies to serve that use case. And let's face it, it's impossible to do that if it's not data-driven and in automated fashion, right? So I think to derive the full value, the promise of 5G, the industry has to embrace data analytics and database automation.
Yeah, so I think Amy made a good point, which is it's only nice to have if you don't care about making money. So if you care about making money, then the analytics becomes a must-have today. I think, Miguel, the point you're making is you're not even going to get a chance to make any money because the network isn't even going to operate if you don't have the analytics underpinnings. Yeah, so I think that's kind of the takeaway there. I had a question here, Miguel, about kind of reactive versus proactive and using new capabilities like predictive analytics. You just touched on that. Maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit more from your perspective, because I think that's probably going to be an area where, again, it's going to be super critical in 5G. I think you're going to have to figure out where things are going to break before they break, right?
Yeah. So today, like continuing with that very tactical example that I was talking about, right? So it's all about assurance, kind of to derive value for ourselves, right? So look at the network behavior and making sure that some indications that maybe are not significant enough to be impacting a customer today, but based on past experience, they are an indication, that are a flag that something is boiling and it might eventually impact the customer, so it's time to take an action. That's already in place today. This is good, right? This is a first step. Now, when you think about some of these licensing use cases, especially on the enterprise side, the enterprises are increasingly demanding SLAs, right? Commitment to SLAs in an end-to-end fashion. And this is something that historically on the wireless side, MNOs have resisted, because wireless by its very nature is hard to predict at times, right? Like you have scarce resources that you are managing through a bunch of different types of customers that are trying to get access to them. But with 5G, these enterprises want to run their business through 5G, and they want to make sure that their service is of a certain quality all the time when they need it. And if you are going to be meeting those SLAs, committing to meeting those SLAs so you can drive the premium, you have to be able to react to the unknown, things that are going to happen in the network in an automated fashion, so you do comply with the SLA. Otherwise, you are in violation, and all of a sudden, your potential incremental revenues and customer stickiness and value is gone, right? So I think, to me, that's a kind of a differentiating factor. We are moving from doing it for ourselves to doing it because it's what the customer is expecting.
All right. So let's do this. I want to go back and look at the results of our poll questions we did earlier. I'm going to put up the results for the first poll, which is level of confidence that machine intelligence will prove superior to human operators. So, bottom line is, will Skynet help us in the long run here? So let's see. We had 4% had low confidence. 26% were highly confident, and then we had a majority of people sort of in the middle of ground, ranging from many concerns to cautiously optimistic. Amy, you want to take a shot at commenting on this? I'd like to hear Miguel and Chris's comments too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is nothing entirely surprising about these results, and I would say that the cautiously optimistic group, to me, it looks like it reflects that first slide that I showed about the progress that operators are making in implementing automations and intelligent automations. That they're starting to see some results in a few pocket areas. They're starting to see how, if they're not quite at closing the loop on some things, they're starting to see how they could, and they're starting to, having gotten their hands a little bit dirty and understanding how these things work. But I think also that the, cautiously optimistic means that the industry has, done a lot of work into trying to figure out, and I know that Guavus has, how to make the tools that they're developing explainable and understandable to the operational teams that are using them. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up the other question here because it's related. I'd be curious to see if we see similar results. Actually, yeah, this actually kind of tracks very closely, right? I think in terms of the percentages, this is a level of confidence in closed loop automation itself. And again, there's the 26% was highly confident, but the bulk of the folks were either cautiously optimistic or have some concerns. Miguel, Chris, your comments on this?
I can take so I actually think this is really good, right? So I would take cautiously optimistic. I understand, and I almost apply a more kind of like human reaction angle to some of these, questions, right? I guess the question that people are asking, or the two questions that people are asking when they look at applying some of these things to run in the network are, first of all, what's in it for me? If I'm the one that is, say, running the network in a more manual way today, what do I get out of this? Or like, so and we need to be able to answer that question, right? So there is we take care of things that are more repetitive, maybe less value adding, and free up the time of the engineer to dream about the next big thing, right? Or how else can we be evolving the network or the service or providing value to the customer? That's one, right? And then the other one that I think is what happens when things don't work, right? And I think that's what goes oftentimes into this being cautiously optimistic, right? Like you need to trust the machine. And I think there is, we are early in this journey, and there is a very human reaction that, yeah, this is all good when it works, but how can I tell when it doesn't? And then what type of guardrails can I define so that if the machine is not working or is not doing what it was supposed to in an automated fashion, I can regain control. So I think are very fair questions, and I think it has to be part of any closed loop orchestration journey or automation. Is how can you prove that it is really working, and then if it isn't, then how can you take over and take whatever actions you need to take.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the fact that both polls were top heavy, it really shows the need. People understand the need to move in this direction, and I think the holdback is that that explainability. So there's a lot of discussion about explainable AI, people understanding what's behind the machine learning so they can understand why it's predicting what it's predicting. So to Miguel's point, that if something doesn't quite work, because everything's not going to be perfect. There's going to be cases where machine learning projects something and that doesn't quite happen. And you have to have these guardrails or some kind of a interjection of a human intelligence. And if you have an explainable AI algorithm that begins, the human intelligence starts with all this evidence, so you don't have to start from scratch. So we're doing a lot of work in the area of explainable AI, making sure that we have evidence on all our decision making, so that a human can more understand the why and accept the recommendations, or also to be able to troubleshoot more effectively when things don't go quite right.
So I'd like to thank you, Chris. I'd like to shift the discussion to sort of operational readiness. So, in any organization, you have a group of operational stakeholders, right? And that can range from network operations, service operations, right through to customer care, even field operations. So for all the different stakeholders that are involved in deploying these 5G networks, what should they be doing to get ready? Operations, network engineering, customer care. And Amy, I think you touched a little bit on the cultural issues in your presentation. Maybe you want to take a shot at this. And Miguel, I'd like to hear, what you're doing specifically at Verizon in terms of readiness.
Sure, I can start with my perspective, and be interesting to see if it chimes with what Miguel is doing on the ground. But I think in my research, trying to understand from industry leaders what works well, what are the success factors that you feel have helped you to be successful in developing and adopting AI and automation in your business. There are a few that really struck home for me. So I think, we come to it time and time and again. It's, we talk about a lot in the software world, but it's just learning to work with cross-functional teams, right? Teams are siloed, and, you report to your line manager, and, yeah, that makes sense from a structural perspective, but when you're actually deploying new types of services that are touching every part of the business and that require, a diverse skill set to bring to market. You can't just have a data scientist, right? You need the software developer, you need the product owner, you need the business person who's involved, and the domain expert, who kind of are all working together towards that common goal if you're going to be able to do this quickly and successfully the first time around. But then I think just a couple more points from a higher level perspective is that if you're trying new things, the whole point is trying to push the barriers and experiment and do new things. There has to be a tolerance for experimentation. And historically, telecoms operators have not had a very high tolerance for this. You look at it a lot in terms of their innovation attempts in the consumer space in particular, and they'll develop something that's perfect and carrier grade and wonderful, and then they bring it to the market and it doesn't fit. They haven't thought about what the customer wants. They're not ready to iterate and adapt. And it takes a different mindset to see that experimentation is a process, that it's valuable, that failing, if it's a, it is not a loss if you understand why you failed and then you don't make it the same mistake again next time. And so I think that, particularly from the executive level, there needs to be room for experimentation. They need to tell their employees that it's okay. And then the last point is that if you're learning new skills and new ways of working, then that should be reflected in your performance metrics, right? If your performance metric is just, you need to hit X revenue, you're not going to spend your time learning a new skill, because that's going to, on the short term, impact your deliverable. But over the long term, it should help. But maybe you need to have that built into your performance metric if you're going to dedicate time to it on a day-to-day basis. So those are a few things that I've found. So, but over to you, Miguel.
Yeah, that's great, Amy. And so I agree. I mean, there is the help the teams embrace data, right? It's easy to tell people embrace data, but what does that mean, right? So give them the tools, give them the training, give them room to play around, right? So that the data speaks to them for what their needs are. I think that is very important, right? Provide all the tool set that makes the data information that is relevant to them. And then I actually like a lot the point on the cultural shift, right? So if you are gonna be allowing more automation to happen, you have to be ready to embrace the cases where things don't quite pan out. And obviously, you need to make sure that you have all the protections in place so that doesn't end up impacting the end customer. But you have some room for experimentation, success, and failures, right? And that is critical for anything where you want to use data to drive decisions, especially as you want to unleash automation. There are cases where things are not going to pan out, and I like what Chris mentioned also earlier, right along the same lines. Is you test and you learn, and sometimes you'll proceed and sometimes you'll have to abandon, and that's just the nature of this. It's unavoidable. Nobody can get everything right first time. But as long as you do that, you provide the tools, provide the culture, and and kind of reinforce that message. And it has to be from the top. I agree, right? It's okay to experiment, it's okay to try, and it's okay to fail sometimes. I think the value becomes evident to everybody, right? Like the more visibility you have, the more information you have, the better you can do your job, and the better you can help other teams too, right? That's another very important point, is transparency between the different functional areas, so that you no longer have to trust somebody for what they are saying. You have a chance to see that same data and make your own interpretation, and at times maybe drive different conclusions.
Yeah, I'd add that communication from the top of the culture is really paramount. It's very difficult, especially in the telecom infrastructure, where you need to have the executives really say it's okay to fail, and at the same time, it's absolutely not okay to have a network outage. So you got both. They say reliability is everything, no failures, and then it's okay to fail. So it's okay to fail on things that don't make the network fail. So network operators have built their reputation on no failures, and then the same executive has to say, but it's okay to pivot a launch that didn't quite work. So communicating that dichotomy is very important and quite difficult.
So we just got an interesting question that I think was a good setup for this next polling question, which is someone basically asked, what are the use cases, that we workaround to build things like machine learning and AI into the network. And I had a topic here to discuss, which is NWDAF, which is in the 5G service-based architecture, which has been specified by the 3GPP. They've designed analytics functions into the architecture, one of which is the network data analytics function. So that's a critical function to enable network orchestration and automation. It's largely what it's concerned with. And I did want to kind of just baseline our audience here in terms of the if we have service providers or operators who are looking at deploying 5G, I am curious, where they might be on their NWDAF journey. So, what's your organization's level of readiness in terms of 3GPP NWDAF in your 5G core? Are you in sort of the investigation phase, doing RFIs, RFPs, testing, evaluating, or have you actually, ready to deploy? The thing about NWDAF is it's actually specified by the 3GPP in terms of a set of use cases. So in release 16, there's about a dozen use cases that have been called out specifically that the analytics function needs to support for the other functions that operate in the 5G core. And then for release 17, there's an extremely long laundry list of possible use cases that the 3GPP is working through. So I'm curious, what folks think about this, and I'd like to have a discussion here with the panelists as well. So I'm going to close the poll out here, and interestingly, we got some good responses here. So not surprisingly, vast majority of folks, almost 2/3, are still in the investigation phase. There are some who are in the RFI, RFP phase, and there's some that are even doing some evaluation and testing work. So that's actually good news, because this is sort of really where the rubber meets the road with analytics and 5G, particularly on the kind of the operational side of things, right? This is ultimately the analytics engine, if you will, that's going to kind of make the network fly. So I'm going to let our panelists discuss this. Miguel, how about you first? Do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, so I can provide some historic context in here as well. So when we did our own RFP for the entire 5G core, we debated quite a bit whether to include the NWDAF. This was mostly release 15 based RFP, and it was just not, the contents were just not detailed enough or scoped enough for it to make sense. So we decided to pull it for a future phase, basically. We are bullish on the NWDAF. We see a lot of value from finally getting, and this is very consistent with the tone of the discussion we've had so far, right? This bringing the analytics into the forefront of the architecture of the network, right? Rather than being an afterthought, and you kind of choose a set of partners that provide solutions that are not standardized. NWDAF kind of counters that, right? And now we're going to have finally a framework for analytics for data collection and exposure that's standardized. Obviously, from an operator perspective, we like that standardization. We like the avoidance of vendor lock-in, so you have flexibility and you can go with the best in breed. Like if I was looking at the poll, we would be in that middle as well, like kind of getting ready to reissue our RFI for the function. And in the meantime, what we've done is bits and pieces of what goes into NWDAF. We have them, we just don't quite call them NWDAF, but we have the enablers in place.
So we got another question here, which I think is a good discussion. And essentially they're asking, how do you see analytics AI shaping up in the networks? In other words, you have needs in the RAN, you have needs in the core, there's the, the OSS functions, the traditional BSS functions. And I'll preface this by saying, the good thing about the 5G service-based architecture is they have specified, in addition to NWDAF, the management data analytics functions, which is essentially a sort of a normalized way to plug analytics into various points in the 5G architecture, whether it's the RAN domain or the core or things like service assurance. And so part of the answer to the question is, well, go read the 5G specs and you'll learn a lot about how people have spent a lot of time thinking about this. But it really begs the question, if you're an operator, Miguel, where do you start, right? And you start with like NWDAF, because without NWDAF, the RAN doesn't even work, right? And then you start to worry about fault management, you start worrying about service assurance, and and on and on. So, what are your thoughts about how you kind of work your way through this this puzzle?
Oh man, so it's a tough one, right? So I think it depends on what your starting point is, right? So we, for example, when you look at the RAN, my RAN counterparts have been working on SON for a long time, so they couldn't wait for NWDAF to be defined by 3GPP, because we had very real needs, right? To this basically run and optimize this massive network that's only getting more complex with more mixes of spectrum and spectrum types and different deployments of small cells, and now different operation modes in 5G. So, SON was built without quite being able to wait for NWDAF. So that's your foundational kind of layer for how the RAN will interface with NWDAF when we deploy it. Kind of similar on the core side, as as I mentioned before, we had started this journey towards virtualization and cloud, so 5 years ago. So some work on resource orchestration started at that time too. So we have quite a bit of lifecycle management capabilities already in place that couldn't quite work for NWDAF. So I think it's very much a function of what your starting point is, how much, and I think Chris made the point before. If you started this journey in your 4G side, you will have a lot of pieces of the puzzle that you can reuse, both from a technology and operational procedures perspective. And then it'll be a matter of integrating all these data points and data feeds into the NWDAF, so then you can hopefully close the loop. If you haven't done this, if you don't have any level of self-optimizing network or RAN analytics collection and so on, then maybe NWDAF is the way to do it from day one.
I'd add that, Miguel, you mentioned before the advent of network slicing coming forward, causing a even more complex network. NWDAF is a terrific way to enable that. You can start, as most operators have started, with basic 5G functionality, with kind of a set of predefined orchestration rules that you don't need the NWDAF for, but you quickly will. You quickly need it. And I think all the operators have recognized that they can get out of the gate with basic functionality, which is a big project all on its own, just to get the RAN out there and the NSA core or the SA core just functioning, and then add the complexity of what's going to happen when we do network slices, and how we're going to manage the 80 different versions now of how we integrate with orchestration. Which you can't do manually any longer. So dropping NWDAF into existing capabilities that have been built, will provide that flexibility you need to truly, unlock the value of 5G.
So we're coming up on the top of the hour here. Amy, I just wanted to ask you, any particular closing remarks or thoughts you have for our attendees here, just listening to this discussion and participating in it?
Yeah, I think what I would end with is that obviously we've had a lot of conversation today about how you apply analytics and automation to make your networks run better, to make them more efficient, to be able to deliver new services like enterprise slicing. And the part of the discussion that I think we haven't had a lot of is how all of these new capabilities and all the stuff that's coming out with 5G really should be fueling innovation, right? And telecoms operators need to be taking all of these skills to be thinking about, well, you touched on it a little bit, Miguel, saying, what's that premium service that we're delivering that we're going to be able to need to meet those SLAs? But there is a lot of opportunity, and I think that what we're seeing is there's a hypothesis that is being formed in the industry, that with the advent of 5G networks and slicing and much more flexibility, that there may be new value to derive from connectivity, while connectivity has actually been on the decline revenue-wise recently. But I think that it's really up for debate whether it's going to be telecoms operators that are going to grab that opportunity, or whether it's going to be new software players that operate on top of the network that are going to grab that opportunity. And I think that telcos need to be thinking about that while they're implementing these new technologies and adopting them. And the standardization plays into that, because particularly if you think about something like edge computing, operators are bringing their national footprint to the game, but application providers that are using the edge want to be able to deploy internationally. So I think that those are the types of things that I would love to have another discussion on after this.
Well, it sounds like we need to have another we'll need to have another webinar then. So with that, I think got a couple of minutes here, so I think we've got to wrap. I'd like to thank each of our panelists for participating. Miguel, Amy, and Chris, I think you each had a great perspective to offer, and each of you offered a different perspective, which is always good. I'd like to remind the attendees here that when we close out, you will see a brief survey pop up on your screen, and if you could take the time to fill that out, that would be very helpful. I hope that everyone who's tuned in here has enjoyed today's discussion, and we look forward to you joining Guavus on a future webinar, hopefully not too far out in the future. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up, and goodbye everyone, and thank you all for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for having us.